The orbital strike warning flashed red across every screen in the command deck. Admiral Cressix's mandibles clicked in what passed for Vrex amusement as he watched the primitive human vessel drift into firing range. One ship, one outdated kinetic rifle, one stubborn woman who refused to see reason. "Target acquired," his weapons officer reported. "Shall we vaporize her now, or after she realizes how utterly outclassed she is?" Cressix almost felt pity. Almost. But the Vrex Dominion didn't conquer 73 star systems by showing mercy to backward species clinging to ballistic technology. He raised one chitinous claw, ready to give the order, when the first round punched through his flagship's shield like it was vapor. Captain Elena Vasquez had learned to ignore the looks, the pitying glances from other pilots, the whispered jokes in station cantinas, the recruitment officers who smiled too politely and suggested she update her certifications for modern warfare. She sat in the cramped cockpit of Last Light, her modified Corvette, running pre-flight diagnostics with hands that knew every relay and bolt by touch. The rifle mounted along the ship's spine was older than she was, a Mark VII railgun her grandfather had salvaged from the Titan station disaster. Chemical propellant, magnetic acceleration, no plasma, no antimatter, just physics, patience, and math that most pilots couldn't be bothered to learn anymore. "Control, this is Vasquez requesting departure clearance." Her voice stayed even despite the static crackling through her headset. Mars Station Control took their time responding. They always did. "Last Light, you're cleared for Bay 7. Try not to embarrass yourself out there." The controller's tone carried that familiar condescension. Young, probably fresh from the academy where they taught pilots to rely on targeting AI and fire-and-forget missiles. Elena didn't respond. She just guided her ship through the docking sequence, feeling the slight shudder as magnetic clamps released. The viewport filled with the red expanse of Mars below and the orbital defense grid stretching in a protective lattice above. Somewhere past that grid, the Vrex fleet had been spotted 3 days ago. 12 capital ships, 40 destroyers, hundreds of fighters with energy weapons that could slag a hull in seconds. And Earth's defense forces were scrambling to mount a response with technology that made the Vrex laugh. She punched coordinates into her navigation system manually. No AI assistance, no predictive algorithms, just her eyes, her hands, and the cold math of ballistics that had won wars back when humanity first reached for the stars. The Mark VII required calculations most pilots found tedious. Trajectory adjustments for planetary rotation, gravitational wells, relative velocity down to the decimal point. One mistake, and you might as well throw rocks. But Elena had made 0 mistakes in 14 engagements. Her comms crackled again. "Vasquez, this is Commander Torres. Fall back to defensive position Delta 7. You're not cleared for forward patrol." She checked her scanner. Delta 7 put her 3,000 kilometers behind the main battle line. A safe distance. A useless distance. "Negative, Commander. I'm moving to intercept vector." "That's a direct order, Captain. Your vessel isn't equipped for—" She switched channels. Torres meant well, but he'd never fired a kinetic round in combat. He trusted shields and point defense lasers, technology that worked beautifully against human opponents, but had proven embarrassingly inadequate against Vrex adaptive shielding. Their ships learned, adjusted, rendered energy weapons nearly useless after the first few hits, but a tungsten carbide slug traveling at 4% light speed? That didn't give them time to adapt. Last Light cleared the orbital grid, and Elena felt the familiar calm settle over her. Out here, past the noise and the doubt, There was only trajectory and timing. She pulled up the firing solution she'd been calculating since the Vrex fleet first appeared on deep space sensors. Her grandfather's voice echoed in memory. Energy weapons are fancy fireworks, mija. But mass? Mass is honest. It doesn't lie, doesn't quit, doesn't care what shields you're hiding behind. The scanner lit up. 23 red dots appeared at extreme range, moving in the arrowhead formation Vrex commanders favored. They weren't even trying to hide. Why would they? Earth's defenses had barely scratched their hulls in the last encounter. This was meant to be a demonstration, a message. Elena's fingers moved across the firing console, inputting variables. Distance, 47,000 kilometers. Relative closing speed, 0.003 c. Gravitational influence from Mars. Negligible at this vector. Solar wind, within acceptable variance. She factored in the Vrex flagship's predictable course correction. They always angled 30 degrees port after reaching firing range, a tactical maneuver that optimized their broadside weapons. The rifle hummed as the magnetic coils began their charging sequence. The sound was different from modern weapons, deeper, patient, like a heartbeat building to something inevitable. Her hands didn't shake as she locked the targeting reticle on empty space. Not where the flagship was, where it would be in 42 seconds. This is Admiral Kresix of the Vrex Dominion to all human vessels. You have one opportunity to withdraw. Failure to comply will result in your immediate... Elena fired. The recoil shoved last light backward despite the dampeners. Through the viewport, she saw nothing. The round was too fast, too small to track visually. But the numbers on her screen told the story. Projectile away. Trajectory optimal. Impact in 39 seconds. She was already loading the second round when the Vrex flagship's shields flared and died. The tungsten slug had punched through their adaptive plating like it was tissue paper, carved through 3 decks, and detonated their primary reactor containment. The explosion was beautiful in the way natural disasters are beautiful. Terrible and undeniable. The remaining Vrex ships scattered, their perfect formation breaking like startled birds. Elena didn't give them time to regroup. Her second shot caught a destroyer attempting evasive maneuvers. Third round sheared the command deck off a cruiser. Each shot required new calculations, new predictions, but her hands moved faster than thought now. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd been mocked for. All vessels, this is Commander Torres. Focus fire on coordinates. He stopped mid-sentence. Vasquez, what the hell are you doing out there? My job, sir. Fourth round. Fifth, the rifle's heat sinks were screaming, but the weapon kept firing, kept proving that sometimes the old ways weren't outdated. They were just patient, waiting for someone who remembered how to use them. A Vrex fighter wing broke off from the main fleet, angling toward her position. 12 ships, each armed with pulse lasers that could cut through last light's hull in seconds. Elena checked her ammunition counter. 11 rounds left. Her shields wouldn't hold against sustained fire. She smiled anyway and recalculated. The Vrex fighters moved like predators who'd never known anything but prey. Their formation was tight, efficient, and completely predictable to anyone who'd studied their tactics. Elena had studied them for 6 months, obsessively. While other pilots were upgrading to plasma cannons and photon torpedoes, she'd been reviewing combat footage frame by frame, mapping patrol patterns, cataloging the 3-second delay in their reaction time when confronted with kinetic threats. 3 seconds. That's how long their combat AI needed to process something that didn't register on energy scanners. She cut her engines and let last light drift. The fighters would read it as systems failure or surrender. They always did. Humans with disabled ships were easy pickings. The lead Vrex pilot accelerated, probably eager to claim the kill before his wingmates could share the glory. Elena waited, counted, felt the cold mathematics of momentum and inertia play out in her mind. At 800 meters, she fired a round straight down, not at the fighters, but at the debris field from the destroyed flagship. The tungsten slug hit a piece of hull plating the size of a cargo container, and physics did the rest. The plating cartwheeled directly into the fighter's path. 2 of them couldn't adjust in time. They crashed into the debris at combat speed. 3 more veered off, their tight formation breaking. The remaining 7 spread out, trying to flank her from multiple vectors. But they were thinking in terms of energy weapons. Weapons that needed line of sight. Weapons that traveled at light speed. Elena's rounds traveled slower, which meant she could make them curve. She fired 3 shots in rapid succession, not at the fighters, but at strategic points in the debris field. Each impact sent massive chunks of wreckage tumbling on calculated vectors. The fighters dodged the first 2 obstacles, their pilots likely cursing the primitive human and her ballistic weapon. The third piece of debris they never saw coming. Elena had bounced her round off 2 separate chunks before it curved back and hammered into the fighter's engine compartment. The explosion lit up her cockpit. 4 fighters left. Her comms exploded with chatter. "Seeing this? How is she? Vasquez, hold position. Reinforcements, inbound." She ignored them. The rifle needed 30 seconds to cool between shots now. 30 seconds where she was effectively unarmed against ships that could fire continuously. She checked her scopes. The main Vrex fleet had stopped advancing. They were regrouping, analyzing, trying to figure out what kind of weapon system could punch through their shields. They wouldn't figure it out, because they were looking for complexity, for some advanced technology they'd somehow missed in their intelligence reports. They couldn't conceive that a single human in an outdated corvette was just better at math than their entire tactical computer network. One of the remaining fighters got brave, or stupid. He charged straight at her, pulse lasers already firing. Elena twisted last light into a barrel roll that made her ribs scream against the acceleration. The lasers scorched past close enough to superheat her hull plating. Proximity alarms shrieked. Her shields dropped to 18%. But the maneuver put her exactly where she needed to be. She fired the moment the rifle's heat sink hit acceptable levels. The round caught the fighter amidships and tore it into glittering fragments. 3 left? The smart ones. The ones who'd figured out they needed to change tactics. They spread out wide, too wide for her to target all of them simultaneously. 1 drew her fire, while the other 2 would flank. Standard pack hunting behavior. Elena had seen it before. Her fingers danced across the console, pulling up a subroutine she'd programmed during her 3rd tour. Most pilots delegated maneuvering to their ship's AI. Elena had disabled hers years ago. She knew last light better than any computer ever could. She fired at the fighter on her 6, then immediately cut power to everything except life support and the rifle. Last light went dark. No energy signature, no heat bloom. Just a dead ship tumbling through space. The 2 flanking fighters hesitated. Their sensors couldn't track a target that wasn't radiating. They pulled together, trying to coordinate visually. Elena counted to 5, then rerouted every joule of stored power directly into the rifle's magnetic coils. The shot that erupted from her weapon was hotter, faster, and angrier than anything the Mark VII was designed to handle. The round screamed through the void and caught both fighters center mass. The force of the explosion sent last lights spinning. She fought the tumble, hands shaking now from adrenaline and the cold that was seeping into the cockpit. Life support coughed back online. Shields began their agonizingly slow recharge. Her heads-up display was a mess of red warnings and system failures, but the rifle was still operational. 6 rounds left. "Vasquez!" Commander Torres's voice cut through the static. "Status report, now. 12 hostiles eliminated, Commander, moving to engage the main fleet." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Negative. You're falling back. That's an order." Elena looked at her scanner. The Vrex fleet had resumed their advance, but something was different. Their formation had tightened. They were moving slower, more cautiously. They were afraid. Good. Fear made people, and apparently Vrex, predictable. "Permission to disregard that order, sir." The silence stretched for 3 seconds. Then Torres sighed. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe." Elena brought her weapon system back online. The targeting reticle painted across the Vrex formation, highlighting weak points, calculating trajectories, predicting evasive maneuvers. "But they'll remember me." She punched the throttle and accelerated toward the fleet, alone, outdated, and absolutely certain of her math. The Vrex adapted quickly. Elena gave them credit for that. By the time she cleared the debris field, they'd shifted to a defensive sphere formation with overlapping shield coverage. Smart. It minimized the angles she could exploit, protected their capital ships behind layers of destroyers and cruisers, forced her to waste ammunition on smaller targets. Or at least, that's what it would force a conventional attacker to do. Elena wasn't conventional. She killed her forward thrust and used lateral jets to drift parallel to their formation at 45,000 kilometers. Maximum range for the Mark VII, but well outside effective range for their energy weapons. The Vrex held position, waiting, analyzing her approach vector. Their tactical computers were probably running thousands of attack simulations. She fired. The round traveled through the space between their ships, passing harmlessly through the gaps in their formation. Their point defense systems didn't even track it. Why waste energy on a projectile that missed? But Elena hadn't missed. The round curved around the gravitational well of Mars, picked up velocity, and came back on a vector the Vrex shields weren't facing. It punched through the engine compartment of a destroyer on their flank. The ship listed, venting atmosphere and debris. The formation broke, not in panic, but in calculated reassessment. They'd never encountered ballistic weapons that could use planetary gravity to curve trajectories. Their shields were designed to face forward, toward threats, not sideways, at rounds that played billiards with celestial mechanics. Admiral Cressix's voice crackled across all channels. "Primitive human, your vessel is impressive. Surrender now, and we will grant you a swift death." Elena adjusted her course and loaded another round. "Counter offer. Leave our system, and I won't turn your fleet into an orbital shooting gallery." She heard the clicking sound Vrex made when they were amused. "You have 4 rounds remaining in your weapon. We have 41 ships. Your mathematics are insufficient." "You're bad at counting." She fired again. This round she aimed at the Vrex flagship itself, not directly, but at the cruiser positioned between her and Cressix's command ship. The tungsten slug hit the cruiser's shield generator, overloaded it, and the resulting electromagnetic pulse cascaded through 3 nearby vessels. Their shields flickered and died for precisely 2.7 seconds. In those 2.7 seconds, Elena fired twice more. Both rounds found homes in the exposed ship's reactor cores. The explosions were sequential, timed perfectly by velocity and distance. The shock wave from the first detonation shoved the second damaged vessel directly into Cressix's flagship. Their hulls screamed as they collided. 3 rounds, Elena said calmly. 45 ships. She paused. Looks like my math checks out. The Vrex fleet scattered, not in retreat, but in genuine confusion. Their tactical doctrine had no protocols for this. No response to a single outdated ship turning fundamental physics into a weapon more devastating than anything in their arsenal. Energy shields could adapt to energy weapons, but kinetic force was absolute. Mass times velocity. No amount of adaptation changed that equation. Elena's hands moved across the console, already calculating her next shot. Her ribs ached. Her eyes burned from staring at screens for the past hour. The cockpit smelled like overheated circuitry and recycled air that was getting thin. Last Light's hull temperature was climbing. The rifle's heat was bleeding through the dampeners. She didn't stop. The Vrex tried a new tactic. 3 destroyers broke formation and accelerated toward her at combat speed, their weapons ports glowing. They planned to get close enough that even if she destroyed one, the others would be in firing range before she could reload. They'd sacrifice ships to eliminate the threat. Standard doctrine. Predictable. Elena waited until they'd committed fully to the charge, until their course was locked, and their momentum too great to adjust quickly. Then she fired her second-to-last round, not at the ships, but at a piece of debris from her earlier kills, a chunk of hull plating tumbling slowly through the void. The impact sent the plating spinning on a new trajectory, straight into the lead destroyer's path. At 0.003 C, the debris hit the destroyer like a hammer. The ship crumpled, its forward momentum carrying it directly into its wingmate. Both vessels became an expanding cloud of wreckage. The third destroyer tried to veer off, but Elena had already calculated that response. She used her last round. The flagship's bridge went silent. She could almost feel it across the void. Admiral Cressix's fleet had entered this system with overwhelming firepower and unshakable confidence. They'd expected terror and submission. Instead, they'd found one woman in a ship held together by spite and welding, using a weapon their great-great-grandfathers would have considered primitive. And she was winning. All ships. Cressix's voice had lost its clicking amusement. Focus all fire on the human vessel. Authorization code Omega 7. No survivors. Elena's scanner lit up like a nightmare. Every remaining Vrex ship turned toward her. Every weapon port began charging. In 15 seconds, enough energy to glass a small moon would converge on Last Light's position. She was out of ammunition. Her shields were at 9%. Her engines were running at 60% efficiency. She had no chance. Elena smiled anyway and redirected all power to the engines, because she'd just realized something beautiful. The Vrex fleet had positioned themselves perfectly, all facing her, all in firing range, all about to discharge enough energy in a concentrated space that if she weren't there to absorb it. She punched the throttle. Last Light leaped forward, acceleration crushing her back into the seat. The Vrex weapons fired in perfect synchronization. Enough destructive force to atomize a battleship converged on the exact coordinates where she'd been floating 3 seconds ago, where the bulk of their own fleet was now positioned. The Vrex had never trained for friendly fire scenarios. Why would they? Their targeting computers were flawless, their coordination perfect. But perfection assumed the target stayed still, assumed it didn't have a pilot crazy enough to thread the needle between 41 hostile vessels at combat speed with failing engines and a prayer. Elena watched in her rear display as the Vrex fleet's own weapons tore through their formation. Ships that had survived her kinetic assault were shredded by their own energy weapons. Shields that had adapted to external threats never considered internal fire. The formation collapsed into chaos. She cleared the kill zone with 4% hull integrity remaining and absolutely nothing left to give except one more calculated insult. She opened a channel to the flagship. "Admiral Cressix, your mathematics were insufficient." Then she cut engines and let last light drift while the Vrex fleet burned. The aftermath tasted like copper and scorched metal. Elena's hands finally started shaking. Delayed adrenaline crash, her training told her. Normal. Expected. She let them shake and focused on breathing. The cockpit air was down to 20% oxygen. Life support was doing its best, but best meant she had maybe 30 minutes before cognitive function started degrading. Through the viewport, the Vrex fleet was retreating. Not scattered, not panicked, but deliberate, calculated. They'd lost 19 ships, more than half their capital vessels, and most of their destroyer screen. The survivors were already burning hard for the system's edge, where they could jump to faster than light and disappear into the black. They'd come to make an example of Earth. Instead, one outdated corvette had made an example of them. "Vasquez," Commander Torres's voice was quiet, different. "What's your status? Life support compromised. Hull integrity critical. Weapon system offline. I'm drifting at current position." She checked her navigation. "Approximately 71,000 kilometers from Mars Station. Too far for a tow with my current oxygen levels." Silence. Then, "We're scrambling rescue shuttles. Stay awake, Captain. That's an order." "Copy." Elena closed her eyes. The shaking was getting worse. Shock, probably. Or maybe just the cold finally catching up. Last light's internal temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Celsius. Her breath came out in pale clouds. The comms crackled again. A new voice, younger, uncertain. "Captain Vasquez, this is Ensign Chen from the Perseverance. I watched what you did out there. We all did. I wanted to say—" The transmission cut off in static. Elena smiled anyway. Chen was probably one of the Academy graduates who'd laughed at her ballistic certification, who'd called the Mark VII a museum piece. Funny how perspective changed when you watched museum pieces delete an invasion fleet. Her console beeped. Incoming transmission. Vrex encryption. She stared at it for a long moment before accepting. Admiral Cressix's face appeared on her screen. Chitinous features arranged in an expression that universal translation software struggled to interpret. "Captain Vasquez." He inclined his head. A gesture. Recognition, maybe. "You have reminded the Vrex Dominion of something we had forgotten. That technology is not the same as tactical superiority." Elena's voice came out hoarse. "Took you long enough to figure out." "Indeed." Cressix's mandibles twitched. "We will not return to this system. Not because we fear your weapons, but because we fear you. One soldier who understands her tools is worth more than a fleet that relies on them." "Good math," Elena said. "Now get out of my sky." The transmission ended. Through the viewport, she watched the last Vrex vessels vanish into jump transit, their warp signatures fading like bad memories. The void was quiet again. Empty, except for debris and the distant lights of Mars Station. Her oxygen gauge ticked down. 22 minutes remaining. Elena pulled up the photo she kept on her personal drive. Her grandfather, in his old Navy uniform, standing in front of a Mark IV railgun, the Mark VII's grandfather. He was smiling. She'd been 12 when the picture was taken, standing next to him at the Smithsonian, both of them dwarfed by the massive weapon that had won the Belt Wars. "Mass is honest," she whispered to the photo. "You were right, abuelo." The rescue shuttle found her with 6 minutes of oxygen remaining. She was barely conscious when they cracked the airlock, hypothermic and hypoxic, but alive. The medic who pulled her out of the cockpit kept saying something about miracles and luck. Elena wanted to correct him. It wasn't luck, it was just physics, but her tongue wasn't working properly. They carried her to the shuttle. Through the stretcher's safety netting, she caught one last glimpse of last light. The Corvette was a wreck. Hull scarred. Heat sinks fused. The Mark VII rifle along its spine was warped and probably irreparable. The whole ship looked like it had gone 10 rounds with a solar flare and lost. But it was still there, still intact, still proving that sometimes the old ways weren't outdated. They were just waiting for someone who remembered why they worked. The shuttle door sealed. Elena closed her eyes and let the darkness pull her under, satisfied. When she woke up in Mars Station Medical, 3 days had passed. Commander Torres was sitting beside her bed, looking older and more tired than she remembered. He stood when her eyes opened. "Captain?" He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology. Several, actually, starting with every time I suggested you update your certification." Elena tried to sit up. Failed. Settled for a weak smile instead. "You're not here to apologize, Commander. What's the situation?" "Quiet. The Vrex haven't been spotted in 3 systems. Our intelligence suggests they're pulling back their forward positions, re-evaluating their expansion strategy." Torres pulled up a datapad. "You've been getting messages, a lot of them, from every branch of Earth's defense forces, from the Academy, from people who want to know how you did what you did." "Math," Elena said. "Same math we've been teaching for 300 years. But nobody uses it anymore. We've gotten soft, reliant. You reminded us that the fundamentals still matter." He paused. "They want to recommission the Mark VII program. Train pilots in kinetic warfare again. They're calling it the Vasquez Protocol." She laughed, which hurt. Everything hurt. "Terrible name. Probably. But it's yours." Torres set the datapad on the side table. "Rest, Captain. When you're cleared for duty, we have a lot of work to do. Turns out there are about 40 mothballed railgun corvettes in the scrapyards that suddenly look a lot more valuable." He left. Elena stared at the ceiling of her medical bay, processing. The Vrex would be back eventually. Species like that didn't give up after one defeat. But next time, maybe Earth would be ready. Maybe there would be other pilots who understood that the newest weapon wasn't always the best weapon. That sometimes victory came down to patience, preparation, and knowing your tools better than the enemy knew theirs. Her grandfather would have liked that, would have been proud. Elena closed her eyes and let herself rest, secure in the knowledge that somewhere in the scrapyards, 40 corvettes were waiting to prove that outdated just meant underestimated. 6 months later, Elena stood in the observation deck of the newly commissioned Mark VII training facility, watching 23 corvettes run firing drills in Mars orbit. The ships moved in calculated patterns, their railguns speaking in synchronized thunder that made the deck plates hum. Each shot was a small star being born, magnetic acceleration turning tungsten into something beautiful and terrible. The pilots were young, eager. They made mistakes that would have gotten them killed in real combat. But they were learning to calculate trajectories by hand, learning to feel the mathematics in their bones, learning that speed and power meant nothing without precision. They're getting better. Commander Torres stood beside her, also watching. He'd been promoted to Director of Kinetic Warfare Division, a posting that hadn't existed 7 months ago. Still slow on the reload sequences, but their accuracy is improving. Accuracy is everything, Elena said. She'd said it so many times in the past months, it had become a mantra. To reporters, to politicians, to wide-eyed recruits who couldn't believe the woman who'd broken the Vrex invasion was standing in front of them. A miss is just expensive garbage in orbit. Torres smiled. You sound like your grandfather. I'll take that as a compliment. She turned from the viewport. Her legs still ached from the frostbite damage, probably would for the rest of her life. Small price for being stupid enough to stay in a dying ship until rescue arrived. How's the last light retrofit going? Slow. The engineers want to preserve as much of the original as possible. Historical significance and all that. But between you and me, she's never flying combat again. The stress fractures run too deep. He pulled up a schematic on his datapad. But we've built 12 ships using her design as a template. Faster, better shielded. Same rifle system. The first squadron launches next month. Elena studied the schematic. Sleeker lines, more efficient heat management. But the core was the same. A Mark VII railgun married to a fast, maneuverable platform. What are you calling them? The Vasquez-class corvettes. Torres raised a hand before she could protest. I know. Terrible name. You don't have to like it. Just accept that you've earned it. She wanted to argue, wanted to say that she'd just done her job, used the tools she'd been trained on, gotten lucky with the math. But the words stuck, because maybe it wasn't about luck. Maybe it was about 20 years of being told she was obsolete and choosing to prove otherwise. Maybe it was about knowing that glory came in different forms, and sometimes the quietest victories were the ones that mattered most. Fine, she said, but I get final approval on the pilots. Already assumed. Torres closed the schematic. There's something else. The Vrex sent a formal communication through neutral channels. They're requesting a meeting. Diplomatic. They claim they want to discuss territorial boundaries and non-aggression protocols. Elena raised an eyebrow. They're scared. Terrified. Our intelligence suggests they've been encountering similar resistance in other sectors. Turns out a lot of species have outdated weapons gathering dust. We weren't the only ones who forgot that old doesn't mean useless. He paused. They specifically requested that you attend the negotiations. Why? Because you embarrassed them. Publicly. Completely. And in their culture, that creates a debt. They want to acknowledge it. Settle accounts. Torres shrugged. Also, I think they're genuinely curious about the human who outthought their entire tactical computer network with a weapon older than most of their officers. Elena looked back at the viewport. The training corvettes had finished their drill and were forming up for landing approach. Perfect spacing. Perfect timing. In 6 months, they had gone from joke to genuine threat. In 6 months, the military doctrine of 3 major powers had shifted because one stubborn woman refused to abandon the fundamentals. Tell the Vrex I'll attend, she said. But I'm bringing a datapad with the ballistic calculations. Let them see exactly how they lost. Torres grinned. That's cruel. That's educational. Elena headed for the exit, her leg complaining with each step. She ignored it. Pain was temporary. Mathematics was eternal. And maybe it'll convince them that the next time they meet a species with primitive weapons, they should reconsider what primitive really means. The training facility's corridors were busy with recruits, engineers, and strategists, all working on the same goal: turn history into a weapon. Make the past protect the future. Elena passed a classroom where an instructor was teaching gravitational slingshot trajectories, another where students were hand-calculating impact velocities. The Mark VII program had become what she'd always known it could be. Not a relic, but a foundation. She reached her office, still small, still cramped, but now with a window overlooking the training bays. On her desk sat the photo of her grandfather. Next to it, a chunk of tungsten carbide from one of her rounds recovered from the wreckage of a Vrex destroyer. A reminder. A promise. The terminal on her desk beeped. Incoming message from Ensign Chen, now Lieutenant Chen, commander of one of the new Vasquez-class corvettes. The message was brief. First test flight successful. She handles like a dream. Thank you for showing us the old ways still work. Elena typed her response. The old ways never stopped working. We just stopped paying attention. Keep practicing your math. She leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The Vrex would come back eventually. Species like that always did. But next time, Earth would be ready. Next time, there would be a fleet of pilots who understood that technology was a tool, not a crutch. Who knew that the newest weapon wasn't always the best weapon? Who remembered that sometimes the answer to overwhelming force was just better math? Her comm chimed. Torres again. Vasquez, we've got 3 admirals asking for presentations on kinetic warfare integration. Also, the Smithsonian wants to borrow Last Light for a permanent exhibit. Tell the admirals I'll send them the training curriculum. Tell the Smithsonian they can have her when I'm done making sure everyone remembers why she mattered. Elena stood, grabbed her jacket. I'm headed to the range. The new recruits need to see what happens when you get the trajectory wrong. You mean when they miss? I mean when they understand that every shot is a promise. And promises should be kept. She left the office and walked through corridors that now smelled like possibility instead of pity. Somewhere above, 23 corvettes were proving that history was just the future that had already happened. That outdated was just another word for underestimated. And that sometimes the weight of tungsten was enough to change everything. Outside the viewport, Mars hung in the black like a promise. The defense grid sparkled. The training ships moved through their endless drills. And Elena Vasquez, the woman they'd called obsolete, the captain who'd fought an entire fleet with mathematics and spite, smiled and went to teach the next generation how to turn physics into poetry. The Vrex had learned their lesson. Now it was time to make sure humanity never forgot theirs.